Before the flood, before Noah's ark, there were beings of light who walked among men. They were called watchers, sent by God to guide humanity. But their hearts turned. Desire replaced duty, and when they fell, heaven's wrath followed. In the silence before creation's first breath, there existed a world unmarked by time, untouched by shadow. It was a realm where the boundaries between heaven and earth were thin as morning mist, where divine beings walked among mortals as easily as wind moves through wheat. This was the world before the flood, before the great cleansing, before the heavens themselves would weep for what was lost. It was a world watched from above by those who were meant to guard, to guide, to protect. They were called the Watchers, and their story begins not with triumph, but with longing. And the Watchers, those who were sent to guard mankind, looked upon the daughters of men and saw that they were fair. The Book of Enoch, that ancient text which time tried to bury and faith tried to forget, speaks of beings who descended from the highest places to walk among us. These were not mere angels in the sense we might imagine today, gentle messengers draped in white robes carrying harps and hymns. These were the Grigori, the vigilant ones, celestial beings of immense power and terrible beauty, tasked with observing humanity's first steps into consciousness. They were watchers in the truest sense, set apart from both heaven and earth, existing in the liminal space between divine perfection and mortal struggle. For ages uncounted, they had fulfilled their sacred duty with unwavering devotion. From their posts in the celestial realm, they observed the children of Adam and Eve as they spread across the fertile lands, as they learned to cultivate grain and domesticate beasts, as they built the first cities and spoke the first prayers. The Watchers saw all, recorded all, reported all to the throne of the Almighty. They were the divine chroniclers of humanity's infancy, witnesses to every joy, every sorrow, every tentative step toward civilization. But watching, it seems, was not enough. Not for all of them. Among their number stood one whose name would echo through the corridors of forbidden knowledge for millennia to come. Semjaza, whose name means name of God, was their leader, their voice, their guiding star. He was chief among the Watchers, first in rank and authority, bearing the weight of command over 200 of heaven's most trusted servants. Yet within his immortal heart, a seed of rebellion had taken root, watered by desire and nurtured by pride. From the heights of Mount Hermon, that sacred peak that pierces the sky like a divine spear thrust into the earth, the Watchers maintained their eternal vigil. Hermon, whose snow-capped summit touches the very clouds, whose slopes have witnessed more history than any chronicler could record, became the staging ground for the greatest act of celestial defiance the world had ever seen. It was here, on this mountain, that stands as a bridge between earth and heaven, that the Watchers would make their choice. The daughters of men grew in beauty and wisdom with each passing generation. No longer the simple, innocent children of paradise, they had become creatures of grace and intelligence, their laughter echoing across valleys, their tears falling like pearls upon the earth. They sang songs that made the very stones weep. They danced with movements that captured the rhythm of creation itself. They loved with hearts that burned brighter than stars. And the Watchers, eternal and perfect as they were, found themselves stirred by longings they had never known, desires that had no place in their celestial nature. Semjaza looked upon his fellow Watchers and saw the same hunger reflected in their eyes, the same desperate yearning that had taken hold of his own immortal soul. He saw Gabriel's lieutenant, Azazel, whose knowledge of metallurgy and warfare surpassed all others. He saw Barakijal, master of astrology, whose understanding of the stars could map the future itself. He saw Kokabel, keeper of the constellations, and Ezekiel, who knew the movements of clouds, and Arakiel, who understood the signs of the earth. 200 Watchers in total, each a master of divine knowledge, each burning with the same forbidden desire. It was then that Semjaza spoke the words that would damn them all, words that would echo through eternity like thunder rolling across an endless sky. He called his brethren together on the peak of Mount Hermon, and there, beneath stars that had watched the world's birth, he proposed a pact that would shatter the very foundations of cosmic order. The Book of Enoch records his words with chilling precision. "Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget us children." But Semjaza was no fool, and he understood the magnitude of what he proposed. He knew that such an act would constitute the ultimate rebellion against the divine order, a transgression so profound that it would shake the pillars of creation itself. And so he added, with the cunning of one who has watched humanity learn the art of shared guilt, "I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." The other watchers understood his meaning immediately. If they were to fall, they would fall together. If they were to face divine wrath, they would face it as one. And so they swore an oath, binding themselves with curses that would ensure their mutual destruction should any among them falter. They bound themselves with mutual imprecations, sealing their fate with words that burned like fire in the celestial realm, words that made the very foundations of heaven tremble. 200 divine beings, creatures of light and power beyond mortal comprehension, stood upon Mount Hermon and chose damnation over duty. They chose desire over divinity. They chose to fall. The descent began not with violence, but with yearning. One by one, they left their celestial posts, abandoning their sacred duty to walk among the children of men. They appeared not as monsters or demons, but as beings of terrible beauty, their divine nature still shining through their rebellious choice, like sunlight through storm clouds. They were gods walking among mortals, and the daughters of men could not resist their otherworldly allure. And they took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to defile themselves with them. The Book of Enoch's words carry the weight of cosmic tragedy, for this was not merely adultery or fornication in the human sense. This was the corruption of the natural order itself, the mingling of divine essence with mortal flesh, the creation of something that should never have existed. The Watchers did not simply take wives. They transformed the very nature of their brides, infusing them with divine power, elevating them beyond their mortal limitations, while simultaneously corrupting their human purity. But the fallen angels' transgression extended far beyond the marriage bed. In their desire to please their new wives and establish dominion over the earth, they began to share the sacred knowledge that had been entrusted to them alone. Secrets that were meant to remain in heaven began to flow like poison into the world of men. Azazel, whose name means God strengthens, became the great teacher of warfare and vanity. The Book of Enoch records his crimes with stark clarity. They taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. Through Azazel's teaching, humanity learned not only how to kill more efficiently, but how to adorn themselves with pride and vanity. He showed them the secrets of cosmetics and jewelry, teaching the daughters of men to paint their faces and deck themselves in gold and precious stones. What had once been simple, natural beauty became artifice and display, and what had once been conflict resolved through strength and cunning became systematic warfare waged with weapons of divine design. Other Watchers contributed their own forbidden gifts to humanity's rapidly expanding knowledge. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, the arts of magic and herbal manipulation that would allow mortals to command forces beyond their natural ken. Armaros revealed the resolving of enchantments, the counterspells and protective wards that would turn magic into an endless arms race between practitioners. Barakijal taught astrology, showing humans how to read the movements of the stars and predict the future, knowledge that was meant to belong to heaven alone. Kokabel revealed the constellations and their significance. while Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds and weather, allowing mortals to predict and perhaps even influence the very sky above them. Arachiel showed them the signs of the earth, the secret language of stones and soil that spoke of hidden treasures and coming earthquakes. Shamsiel revealed the signs of the sun, teaching humanity to mark time and seasons with divine precision. Each gift, each revelation, each sharing of celestial knowledge was both a blessing and a curse. Humanity advanced at an unprecedented pace, their understanding of the world around them expanding exponentially. They learned to work metal with skill that rivaled the divine smiths, to navigate by stars with accuracy that impressed even their angelic teachers, to heal with herbs and harm with poisons with equal facility. They became more than human, yet less than they had been. The consequences of this divine instruction were swift and terrible. Humanity, armed with knowledge they were not ready to possess, began to transform their world in ways that horrified even their celestial teachers. The simple tools of agriculture became weapons of war. The healing herbs became instruments of murder. The knowledge of the stars became the foundation for dark prophecies and magical practices that sought to compel the very forces of creation. But perhaps most terrible of all were the children born of these unholy unions. The Book of Enoch speaks of them with a mixture of awe and horror. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. These Nephilim, as they came to be known, were beings of immense size and terrible appetite. Born of divine fathers and mortal mothers, they possessed superhuman strength and insatiable hunger. 3,000 ells in height, they towered over ordinary humans like mountains over hills, their very footsteps shaking the earth, their voices rumbling like thunder across the land. At first, humanity welcomed these giant offspring, seeing in them the promise of protection and power. The Nephilim became kings and heroes, ruling over vast territories with their divine strength and inherited knowledge. They led armies, built great cities, and performed feats that seemed to prove their divine heritage. For a time, it seemed as though the union of heaven and earth had produced a new and glorious race that would elevate all of creation. But the Nephilim's divine nature came with divine appetites, and soon their consumption exceeded what the earth could provide. They devoured not just food, but the very substance of human civilization. They consumed all the acquisitions of men, stripping the land bare, emptying the granaries, slaughtering entire herds to satisfy their monstrous hunger. When the fruits of human labor could no longer sustain them, they turned their appetites toward humanity itself. The giants began to devour mankind, literally consuming the very people who had once revered them as gods. They became cannibals on a scale that defied imagination, their divine heritage twisted into something monstrous and unnatural. The earth ran red with blood, and the cries of the innocent rose to heaven like smoke from a sacrificial altar. Meanwhile, the corruption spread beyond the giants themselves. The forbidden knowledge shared by the Watchers had taken root in human society, growing like a cancer that consumed everything pure and natural. Men learned not just to make war, but to revel in it. Women learned not just to beautify themselves, but to use their beauty as a weapon. The arts of magic and divination flourished, but they were turned toward domination and destruction rather than wisdom and healing. The world that had once been paradise became a realm of horror, where the strong devoured the weak, where knowledge was hoarded by the powerful, where the very sky seemed to weep for what had been lost. The natural order that God had established at creation was turned upside down, and chaos reigned where once there had been harmony. And so the earth groaned beneath the weight of its own corruption, crying out to the heavens for deliverance from the nightmare it had become. The very stones themselves seemed to weep, and the rivers ran thick with blood and sorrow. This was no longer the world that had emerged fresh from the Creator's hand, no longer the garden where humanity had taken its first innocent steps. It had become something else entirely, a realm where divine knowledge served mortal evil, where celestial power had been twisted into instruments of destruction. The cries of the innocent pierced the veil between earth and heaven like arrows shot from the depths of despair. They rose beyond the clouds, beyond the stars, beyond the furthest reaches of creation itself, until they reached the throne room of the Almighty. There, before the seat of all power and glory, stood the faithful angels who had not fallen, who had watched in horror as their brethren descended into rebellion and their charges descended into chaos. Michael the archangel, whose name means "who is like God," stood foremost among them. His face bore the weight of cosmic sorrow, for he had witnessed the corruption of creation itself. Behind him stood Raphael, the healer, whose very essence recoiled at the suffering that now plagued the earth. Gabriel, the messenger of divine will, trembled with righteous fury at the perversion of heavenly knowledge. And Uriel, whose name means flame of God, burned with the fire of divine justice. Together these faithful servants of the Most High lifted their voices in a lament that shook the very foundations of paradise. The Book of Enoch records their words with the precision of scribes who understood that they were witnessing the judgment of ages. And they said one to the other, "The earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven. And now to you, the holy ones of heaven, the souls of men make their suit, saying, 'Bring our cause before the Most High.'" The archangels bore witness to atrocities that defied the natural order. They saw the Nephilim, those hybrid offspring of divine rebellion, stalking across the earth like moving mountains of destruction. They witnessed cities burned to ash by beings whose strength could shatter stone with a touch, whose appetites could not be satisfied by any earthly abundance. They observed humanity itself, once innocent and pure, now corrupted by knowledge they were never meant to possess, wielding weapons forged from celestial wisdom to wage wars that turned the very soil crimson. "And thou seest what Azazel hath done," the archangels continued in their petition, "who hath taught all unrighteousness on earth and revealed the eternal secrets which were preserved in heaven, which men were striving to learn. The weapons of war that now littered every battlefield, the cosmetics that turned natural beauty into artificial allure, the magical practices that sought to compel the forces of creation itself. All of these had flowed from the corrupted fountain of Azazel's teaching. But Azazel was not alone in his transgression. "And Semjaza, to whom thou hast given authority to bear rule over his associates," they proclaimed, had led 200 of heaven's finest into damnation. The leader of the Watchers had become the architect of cosmic rebellion, and his influence had spread like poison through the ranks of the celestial host. Each Watcher who had sworn the oath on Mount Hermon had contributed to the growing catalog of divine knowledge, perverted for earthly ends. The Most High, whose silence had endured while his creation writhed in agony, finally spoke. His voice, which had once called forth light from darkness and order from chaos, now thundered with the weight of ultimate judgment. The time for patience had ended. The time for mercy had passed. The time for cleansing had come. And the Lord said unto Gabriel, "Go to the bastards and to the reprobates and to the children of fornication, and destroy the children of fornication and the children of the Watchers from amongst men, and cause them to go forth. Send them one against the other, that they may destroy each other in battle." The divine command rang through the heavenly realm with the finality of thunder, sealing the fate of the Nephilim and their corrupted world. To Michael, the warrior archangel, came a different command. "Go, bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated." The punishment for Semjaza and his fellow rebels would be imprisonment in the deepest places of the earth, bound in darkness until the final judgment. They who had once soared through the celestial realm would be chained beneath mountains, sealed away from the light they had abandoned in their pursuit of forbidden desires. 70 generations would pass before their fate was finally sealed. 70 generations of humanity that would live and die while the fallen watchers languished in their earthly prison. But for Azazel, the great corrupter, the teacher of warfare and vanity, a special torment was reserved. And to Raphael he said, "Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light." The divine architect of corruption would be buried alive, entombed beneath jagged stones in the wasteland of Dudael, never again to look upon the light of heaven or earth. The knowledge he had shared so freely would become his curse, for he would spend eternity remembering what he had lost while unable to see what remained. Yet even these punishments were merely the beginning. The corruption had spread too far, penetrated too deeply into the fabric of creation itself. The earth had become a cancer upon the cosmos, and like any cancer, it required radical surgery. The Most High looked upon the world he had made and saw that it could not be healed. It must be cleansed. And to Noah he said, "Tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it." The faithful patriarch, that righteous man who walked with God in a world gone mad, would be the vessel of salvation for what could still be saved. The waters would rise, covering every mountain, drowning every valley, washing away the cities of the giants and the kingdoms of the corrupted. The Nephilim, for all their divine strength, would perish beneath the crushing weight of the flood. The weapons forged with celestial knowledge would rust at the bottom of the sea. The magical practices taught by the Watchers would be silenced beneath the roar of universal destruction. But the knowledge itself, the forbidden wisdom that had corrupted paradise, would not die so easily. Seeds of it would survive in the memory of Noah's descendants, fragments preserved in stories and songs, echoes that would resurface throughout human history whenever mortals again reached toward divine knowledge with impure hearts. The Book of Enoch, this ancient chronicle of cosmic rebellion and divine judgment, was not merely another religious text gathering dust in forgotten libraries. For centuries, it held a place of honor among the faithful, its words quoted by apostles and preserved by monks who understood its terrible significance. The Epistle of Jude itself references Enoch's prophecy, declaring, "And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all." Among the sacred scrolls discovered in the caves of Qumran, fragments of the Book of Enoch were found, preserved by the desert community that saw in its pages not fantasy, but fundamental truth about the nature of divine rebellion and human corruption. These were not primitive superstitions or mythological tales spun by ignorant ancestors, but revelations of cosmic truth that helped explain the perpetual struggle between good and evil, between divine order and mortal chaos. Yet as Christianity evolved and the Church sought to establish canonical boundaries, the Book of Enoch gradually fell from favor. By the 4th century, as councils convened to determine which texts would be included in official scripture, Enoch's visions were deemed too strange, too detailed in their description of angelic hierarchy, too specific in their cosmological claims. The Church Fathers, seeking unity and clarity in doctrine, chose to exclude texts that might invite theological confusion or encourage dangerous speculation about the nature of divine beings. The irony was profound. A book that warned against the dangers of forbidden knowledge was itself forbidden, deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers to read. The very text that chronicled the fall of the Watchers became itself a kind of fallen scripture, remembered by scholars but hidden from the faithful. Its truths were preserved in fragments, echoes, and illusions, like light filtering through stained glass windows that cast colored shadows, but never revealed the full brightness of the source. In monasteries and scriptoriums across the Christian world, copies of Enoch gathered dust or were deliberately destroyed, their wisdom deemed too perilous for mortal minds. Yet the book refused to die completely. In Ethiopia, the ancient church preserved it as canonical scripture. In Armenia and other corners of the Christian world, fragments survived in translations and commentaries. The text lived on, like the imprisoned watchers themselves, bound but not destroyed, silenced but not voiceless. For those who did encounter Enoch's revelations, the impact was profound and lasting. Here was an explanation for the existence of evil that went beyond simple moral failure or human weakness. Here was a cosmology that placed earthly struggles within a vast framework of celestial conflict. Here was a narrative that showed how divine gifts could become instruments of corruption when wielded by impure hearts. The story of the Watchers became a mirror in which humanity could see its own reflection, its own tendency to reach beyond proper boundaries, to seek knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility. Every human achievement tainted by pride, every discovery turned toward destruction, every gift corrupted by selfishness, all found their archetype in the tale of the fallen angels who chose desire over duty, rebellion over righteousness. Modern scholars have traced the influence of Enochic literature throughout Western civilization, finding its fingerprints in medieval texts about angels and demons, in Renaissance treatises on magic and natural philosophy, in romantic poetry that explored the psychology of rebellion, and in contemporary fiction that grapples with the consequences of forbidden knowledge. The Watcher's story resonates across millennia because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the tension between the desire to transcend our limitations and the wisdom to accept them. In their desire to become gods, the Watchers fell, and in their fall, they taught mankind to dream of forbidden things. They showed humanity that even divine beings could be corrupted by desire, that knowledge without moral restraint led inevitably to destruction, that the price of transcendence might be the very thing one sought to transcend. Their legacy lived on not in the hybrid giants they fathered or the weapons they taught mortals to forge, but in the eternal human struggle between aspiration and humility, between the hunger for more and the wisdom to know when enough was enough. The floodwaters that drowned their corrupted world have long since receded, but the questions they raised continue to flow through human consciousness like underground rivers. What knowledge should remain forbidden? What boundaries should not be crossed? What price are we willing to pay for the power to reshape our world according to our desires? The Watcher's choice echoes in every laboratory where scientists push against the limits of natural law, in every boardroom where power brokers decide the fate of nations, in every human heart that yearns for something beyond its reach. And so the Watcher's legacy endured not in monuments of stone or chronicles of kings, but in the very fabric of human ambition itself. Their rebellion had planted seeds that would sprout in every generation, in every heart that gazed upward and whispered the ancient question: why must we remain bound by the limitations of flesh when divinity beckons just beyond our reach? The waters of the great deluge had long since receded, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean, yet somehow still carrying the memory of what had been. Noah's descendants spread across the earth like seeds scattered by divine wind, carrying within their blood both the promise of redemption and the echo of that primal hunger that had doomed their ancestors. They built new cities, forged new weapons, discovered new secrets hidden in the movements of stars and the properties of metals. Yet with each advancement, each breakthrough, each moment of transcendent understanding, the shadow of the Watchers fell across their achievements like twilight across a harvest field. In the great libraries of Babylon, scribes record that would have made it astronomical observations with precision Barakajal proud, mapping the heavens with mathematical elegance that bordered on the divine. They calculated eclipses decades in advance, tracked the wandering stars through their celestial dance, and developed calendars that captured the rhythm of eternity itself. Yet their knowledge came tinged with the same pride that had corrupted their angelic teachers, the same assumption that understanding the mechanics of creation somehow granted mastery over it. The smiths of Damascus learned to fold steel upon itself until it became harder than the bones of giants, creating blades that could cleave through armor as easily as wheat. Their techniques passed from master to apprentice in whispered secrets, each generation building upon the last until the simple tools of agriculture had evolved into instruments of war that would have satisfied Azazel's most ambitious dreams. They wrought beauty and terror in equal measure, their creations serving both the harvest and the battlefield with impartial excellence. In the temples of Egypt, priests of writing mathematicians developed systems and calculation that allowed them to erect monuments that seemed to touch the very stars. They mummified their dead with chemical precision that defied decay. They aligned their pyramids with constellations that mark ages, and they claimed the passage of cosmic dominion over death itself through elaborate rituals and magical formulas. Their pharaohs declared themselves gods incarnate, walking bridges between the mortal and divine realms, yet their empires crumbled into sand like all things touched by human pride. The pattern repeated itself across every civilization that rose from the post-Diluvian world. Each discovery, each technological leap, each moment of apparent transcendence carried within it the seeds of its own corruption. The very knowledge that elevated humanity above the beasts of the field also separated them from the simple faith that had once connected them directly to their Creator. They learned to read the signs of the earth and sky, but in doing so, they began to trust their own interpretations more than the voice that had once walked with them in the cool of evening. The Greeks, those lovers of wisdom and beauty, developed philosophies that sought to explain the nature of existence through reason alone. Their greatest minds constructed elaborate systems of thought that promised to unlock the fundamental principles governing reality itself. They spoke of forms and substances, of prime movers and eternal truths, building intellectual cathedrals that rivaled any physical architecture in their ambition and complexity. Yet their wisdom, for all its elegance, could not bridge the gap between understanding and being, between knowledge and righteousness. Their mythology, too, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of the Watcher's legacy. They told stories of titans who rebelled against the gods, of Prometheus who stole fire from heaven to give to mortals, of heroes born from the union of divine and human parents who possessed strength beyond mortal ken. In these tales, the ancient memory of the Nephilim lived on, transformed by countless retellings, but retaining the essential truth that the mingling of celestial and terrestrial natures produced wonders and horrors in equal measure. The Romans, those master engineers and administrators, built roads that connected continents and aqueducts that brought water flowing across impossible distances. Their legions marched in formations that would have impressed the angelic hosts, their discipline and organization creating an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. They codified laws that sought to bring order to human society, establishing principles of justice and governance that would influence civilization for millennia. Yet their very success bred the arrogance that would ultimately destroy them, the assumption that human will and organization could impose permanent order upon the chaos of fallen creation. Throughout these civilizations, mystery schools and secret societies preserved fragments of the forbidden knowledge that had once flowed so freely from angelic lips. They spoke in whispers of hermetic wisdom, of alchemical transformations that promised to turn base metals into gold and mortal flesh into something approaching divinity. Their initiates studied sacred geometry and mystical mathematics, seeking to decode the hidden patterns that governed reality itself. They claimed to possess keys that could unlock the doors between worlds, formulas that could compel the forces of nature to serve human will. Yet always, the shadow of judgment lingered over their endeavors. The story of the Watchers served as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that even the highest knowledge could become the deepest corruption when wielded by hearts that had forgotten their proper place in the cosmic order. The very texts that preserved this wisdom, including the Book of Enoch itself, became themselves objects of suspicion, too dangerous for ordinary minds to contemplate without proper preparation and guidance. As Christianity spread across the ancient world, it carried with it this complex relationship to the Enochic tradition. The apostles themselves had quoted from the book, recognizing in its pages truths that illuminated the nature of spiritual warfare and divine judgment. The early church fathers found in Enoch's visions a framework for understanding the origin of evil, the reality of angelic hierarchies, and the cosmic scope of God's redemptive plan. Yet they also recognized the dangers inherent in too much speculation about celestial matters, the temptation to seek forbidden knowledge that had led to humanity's first great catastrophe. The communities at Qumran, those desert ascetics who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, clearly considered the Book of Enoch to be of paramount importance. Among their carefully maintained library, multiple copies of Enochic texts were found, suggesting that these seekers of divine truth saw in the ancient patriarchs' visions essential insights into the nature of their own struggle against the forces of darkness. They lived in deliberate separation from the corrupted world, seeking to maintain ritual purity while awaiting the final judgment that would vindicate the righteous and destroy the wicked. Yet as the church grew and evolved, as it moved from a persecuted minority to an established institution, the practical necess began to outweigh the mystities of organizational insights of texts like Enoch. The councils of bishops who gathered to define orthodox doctrine found themselves faced with the challenge of preserving essential truths while protecting ordinary believers from dangerous speculation. The Book of Enoch, with its detailed descriptions of angelic hierarchies and cosmic geography, its specific names for fallen angels and elaborate accounts of their various corruptions, seemed too likely to encourage the very kind of spiritual pride that had destroyed the Watchers themselves. The decision to exclude Enoch from the canonical scriptures was not made lightly or without controversy. Church leaders recognized the text's ancient pedigree and apostolic endorsement, but they also saw the practical dangers of encouraging believers to focus too heavily on angelology and eschatology at the expense of simple faith and moral living. They had witnessed the confusion and division that arose when different groups claimed special revelations about the nature of divine beings or the timeline of future events. In their desire to maintain unity and orthodoxy, they chose to emphasize texts that focused on salvation through Christ rather than elaborate cosmological speculations. This canonical exclusion created a peculiar fate for the Book of Enoch. It became a text that was simultaneously revered and forbidden, acknowledged as containing truth while being deemed too dangerous for general circulation. Scholars and mystics continued to study it in secret, finding in its pages insights that complemented and illuminated the canonical scriptures. Yet ordinary believers were discouraged from reading it, protected from knowledge that might lead them astray from the narrow path of righteousness. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, isolated from the theological developments of the Byzantine and Roman worlds, continued to treat Enoch as canonical scripture. In their ancient liturgies and commentaries, the story of the Watchers retained its full force as a warning about the dangers of spiritual pride and the consequences of abandoning one's proper place in the divine order. Their monks copied and recopied the text through the centuries, preserving it through the Dark Ages when it had largely disappeared from European consciousness. Meanwhile, in the monasteries and scriptoriums of medieval Europe, fragments of Enochic tradition survived in various forms. Some found their way into apocryphal works and pseudepigraphal texts that circulated among scholars and mystics. Others influenced the development of Christian angelology, contributing to the elaborate hierarchies and classifications that medieval theologians developed to explain the nature of celestial beings. The influence was often indirect and unacknowledged, but the fingerprints of Enoch's vision could be traced through centuries of Christian thought about angels, demons, and the ongoing cosmic battle between good and evil. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in ancient texts and esoteric wisdom, and scholars began to seek out manuscripts of Enoch that had been preserved in Ethiopian and other Eastern churches. Humanist philosophers and natural magicians found in the book's detailed accounts of angelic knowledge a framework for understanding their own investigations into the hidden forces of nature. They saw in Azazel's teaching of metallurgy and warfare a precedent for the idea that divine knowledge could be transmitted to humanity through angelic intermediaries, though they were often blind to the warnings about the corrupting effects of such knowledge. The Protestant Reformation, with its emphasis on returning to biblical sources and rejecting later ecclesiastical traditions, created new opportunities for texts like Enoch to be rediscovered and studied. Some reformers argued that books quoted by apostles should be considered canonical, regardless of later church decisions to exclude them. Others maintained that the early church's wisdom in establishing canonical boundaries should be respected, even if individual books contained valuable insights. The debate reflected deeper tensions about the relationship between divine revelation and human reason, between mystical insight and practical piety. As the modern era dawned and scientific revolution transformed human understanding of the natural world, the Book of Enoch took on new significance as both historical document and prophetic warning. Scholars began to study it not just as religious literature, but as evidence of ancient cosmological beliefs and mythological traditions. They traced its influence through various cultures and identified parallels in other ancient texts that suggested common sources or widespread diffusion of similar ideas. Yet the deeper questions raised by Enoch's narrative remained as relevant as ever. In an age when human knowledge was expanding at an unprecedented pace, when scientific discoveries promised to unlock the fundamental secrets of matter and energy, when technological innovations offered possibilities that previous generations would have considered divine prerogatives, the story of the Watchers served as a haunting reminder of the potential consequences of knowledge without wisdom, power without moral restraint. The atomic age brought these questions into sharp focus. Scientists who split the atom and harnessed nuclear energy found themselves grappling with responsibilities that seemed almost godlike in their scope and consequences. The weapons they created could destroy entire cities in moments, while the peaceful applications of their discoveries promised to transform human civilization in fundamental ways. Like the Watchers sharing their celestial knowledge with humanity, they had opened doors that could never be closed, released forces that would reshape the world regardless of the intentions of their discoverers. The parallels were not lost on thoughtful observers, who saw in the nuclear age an echo of the antediluvian world described in Enoch's visions. Once again, humanity possessed knowledge that seemed almost divine in its scope and power. Once again, the temptation existed to use that knowledge for domination rather than service, for destruction rather than healing. Once again, the question arose whether mortals were ready for the responsibilities that came with such tremendous capabilities. In their laboratories and research facilities, modern scientists continued the work that Azazel had begun so long ago on the slopes of Mount Hermon. They unlocked the secrets of metallurgy that allowed them to create materials stronger than anything found in nature. They mapped the movements of celestial bodies with precision that exceeded the astronomical knowledge taught by Barakijal. They developed weapons that made the swords and shields revealed to ancient humanity seem like children's toys by comparison. Yet the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Each breakthrough brought with it both tremendous potential for good and terrible possibilities for evil. Each discovery that promised to elevate humanity also carried the risk of corruption and destruction. The knowledge itself was neutral, but the hearts that received it were still tainted by the same pride and selfish ambition that had motivated the original rebellion in heaven. The Book of Enoch stood as a witness to this eternal human struggle, a reminder that the quest for transcendence through knowledge alone was a path fraught with peril. Its preservation through centuries of neglect and suppression testified to the enduring power of its central insight, that the greatest dangers facing humanity often came not from ignorance, but from wisdom corrupted by pride. Not from powerlessness, but from power wielded without humility. In the end, the Watchers' legacy lived on, not in the physical traces of their rebellion. The bones of giants had long since crumbled to dust. The weapons they taught mortals to forge had rusted away. The cities their hybrid children had ruled had been swallowed by time and sand. But in the perpetual tension between human aspiration and divine order, between the desire to transcend limitations and the wisdom to accept them, their story continued to unfold in every laboratory where researchers pushed against the boundaries of natural law, in every boardroom where decisions were made that would affect millions of lives, in every human heart that yearned for something beyond its reach. The questions they had raised echoed through the corridors of history. What knowledge should remain forbidden? What boundaries should not be crossed? What price was humanity willing to pay for the power to reshape creation according to its own desires? The flood that had cleansed their corrupted world was both historical event and eternal warning, a reminder that even the patience of the divine had limits, that there were lines that could not be crossed without consequences that extended far beyond the individual transgressor. In choosing rebellion over righteousness, desire over duty, the Watchers had not merely fallen, they had shown humanity a path that led inevitably to its own destruction, a route that every generation would have to choose, either to follow or reject. And so their watch continued, not from the heights of heaven, but from the depths of their earthly prison, bound until the final judgment, yet somehow still present in every human choice between wisdom and folly, between service and self-aggrandizement, between the narrow path of righteousness and the broad highway that led to destruction. Their rebellion had ended in chains, but their influence lived on in the eternal human struggle to find the balance between aspiration and humility, between reaching for the stars and remembering the ground beneath one's feet. The threads of their influence wove themselves into the fabric of human ambition like golden wire through dark cloth, beautiful and corrupting in equal measure. In the centuries that followed the Great Cleansing, as new civilizations rose from the mud of the receded waters, the patterns established by the Watchers' rebellion manifested again and again, each iteration a variation on the same eternal theme of knowledge pursued without wisdom, power grasped without humility. In the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, priest-kings claimed divine authority, while their astronomers mapped the heavens with precision that would have impressed Barakijal himself. They built towers that reached toward the sky, monuments to human ambition that echoed the ancient desire to bridge the gap between earth and heaven through will and ingenuity rather than grace and submission. Their cuneiform tablets recorded not just laws and trade agreements, but incantations and magical formulas that sought to compel the very forces of creation to serve mortal desires. The knowledge they preserved in their temple libraries bore the unmistakable signature of the forbidden wisdom once freely shared by fallen angels. Metallurgical techniques that allowed them to work bronze and iron with supernatural skill, astronomical calculations that predicted eclipses and planetary conjunctions with divine accuracy, mathematical principles that enabled the construction of architectural marvels that defied conventional understanding of structural engineering. Each breakthrough carried within it both the promise of transcendence and the seed of corruption that had destroyed the antediluvian world. In Egypt, the pharaohs declared themselves living gods, walking embodiments of divine power who commanded the forces of nature through elaborate rituals and magical practices. Their priests developed mummification techniques that sought to defeat death itself, preserving the physical body through chemical processes that demonstrated an understanding of decay and preservation that bordered on the supernatural. They aligned their pyramids with stellar constellations, creating monuments that served as both tombs and astronomical instruments, bridges between the mortal realm and the eternal sphere of the gods. The papyri that survived from their ancient libraries contained formulas for transformation that echoed the alchemical knowledge first revealed by angelic teachers. spells for transmuting base materials into precious substances, rituals for communicating with beings from other realms, medical procedures that combined herbal knowledge with supernatural invocations. The line between science and magic blurred in their practices, just as it had in the world before the flood when divine knowledge flowed freely among mortals unprepared to receive it. Greek philosophers attempted to systematize this inherited wisdom, creating elaborate frameworks of thought that promised to explain the fundamental nature of reality through reason alone. Their academies became temples to human intellect, places where the greatest minds gathered to push against the boundaries of mortal understanding. They spoke of ideal forms existing in perfect realms beyond the material world, of prime movers and eternal principles that governed the cosmos through mathematical precision and logical necessity. Yet even their most sophisticated theories carried within them the same fatal flaw that had destroyed their angelic predecessors: the assumption that understanding the mechanisms of creation somehow granted mastery over them. Their pursuit of wisdom, noble as it appeared, was tainted by the same pride that had motivated Semjaza's original rebellion. They sought to become gods through knowledge rather than to serve the true God through humble obedience. Their mythology preserved the memory of the Watchers' rebellion in countless variations. Stories of titans who challenged the gods, of Prometheus who stole fire from heaven, of heroes born from divine mortal unions who possessed strength beyond human ken. These tales served as both entertainment and warning, reminding each generation that the desire to transcend mortal limitations had been the source of both humanity's greatest achievements and its most terrible catastrophes. The Romans, those master engineers of the ancient world, demonstrated the practical applications of accumulated wisdom with unprecedented efficiency. Their roads connected continents, their aqueducts brought fresh water across impossible distances, their military formations conquered nations with mechanical precision. They codified laws that sought to impose rational order upon the chaos of human society, creating governmental structures that promised stability through human wisdom rather than divine guidance. Yet their very success bred the arrogance that would ultimately destroy them. The same organizational genius that built their empire also convinced them that human will and intellect could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, defeat any enemy. They began to worship their own achievements, to see in their military victories and architectural marvels proof of their inherent superiority over both nature and the gods. Their emperors demanded to be worshipped as deities, claiming the same divine prerogatives that had once been reserved for heaven alone. The pattern repeated itself with wearisome consistency across every civilization that rose from the ashes of the old world. Each discovery, each technological advance, each moment of apparent transcendence carried within it the seeds of spiritual corruption. The very knowledge that elevated humanity above the beasts also separated them from the simple faith that had once connected them directly to their Creator. They learned to read the signs of earth and sky, but in doing so, they began to trust their own interpretations more than the voice that had once walked with them in the garden. Mystery schools and secret societies arose to preserve the most dangerous fragments of angelic knowledge, passing them down through carefully guarded initiations and elaborate rituals. They spoke in whispers of hermetic wisdom, of alchemical transformations that promised to turn base metals into gold and mortal flesh into something approaching divinity. Their adepts studied sacred geometry and mystical mathematics, seeking to decode the hidden patterns that governed reality itself. These underground streams of forbidden knowledge flowed through history like poison rivers, surfacing occasionally in the works of medieval magicians, Renaissance natural philosophers, and Enlightenment scientists who thought they were discovering new truths when they were actually rediscovering ancient corruptions. Each generation believed itself to be the first to unlock the secrets of nature, unaware that they were following paths first traced by angelic feet in the world before the flood. The church fathers of early Christianity recognized these patterns and struggled to find the proper balance between preserved witnessed the confusion and division that arose winning essential truths and protecting believers from dangerous speculation. They have different groups claimed special revelations about the nature of divine beings or the mechanics of spiritual transformation. The Book of Enoch, with its detailed descriptions of angelic hierarchies and cosmic geography, seemed too likely to encourage the very kind of pride that had destroyed the Watchers themselves. Augustine of Hippo, that great theologian who helped shape Christian doctrine for centuries to come, warned against the dangers of curiositas, the prideful desire to know things that were not meant for mortal minds to comprehend. He had seen how the pursuit of hidden knowledge could lead even sincere believers astray, drawing them into speculation about divine mysteries that served to inflate their spiritual ego rather than increase their humble submission to God's will. Jerome, the scholar saint who translated the scriptures into Latin, expressed similar concerns about texts that provided too much detail about the workings of the celestial realm. He recognized that such knowledge, however true it might be, could easily become a source of temptation for those who sought to elevate themselves through superior understanding rather than superior obedience. The exclusion of Enochic literature from the canonical scriptures was motivated not by doubt about its authenticity, but by wisdom about its potential for misuse. Yet the Ethiopian Church, isolated from the theological developments of the Mediterranean world, continued to preserve the Book of Enoch as sacred scripture. Their monks copied and recopied the ancient text through centuries of political upheaval and cultural change, maintaining its full force as a warning about the consequences of spiritual pride. In their liturgies and commentaries, the story of the Watchers retained its power to illuminate the ongoing struggle between divine order and rebellious ambition. The medieval period saw the emergence of new forms of the ancient pattern as Christian civilization grappled with the legacy of classical learning. Scholastic theologians attempted to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with biblical revelation, creating elaborate systems of thought that promised to explain the nature of God through human reason. Their cathedrals of logic and their universities of learning represented remarkable achievements of human intellect. Yet they also carried the subtle danger of intellectual pride that had corrupted their predecessors. Alchemists working in secret laboratories pursued the dream of transmutation that had first been whispered by angelic lips to antediluvian humanity. They sought to discover the philosopher's stone that would grant mastery over matter itself, to develop the elixir of life that would defeat death through chemical means rather than spiritual transformation. Their experiments combined genuine scientific observation with magical practices inherited from the mystery schools, blurring the line between natural philosophy and supernatural manipulation. The Renaissance brought an explosion of interest in Hermetic texts and esoteric wisdom as scholars rediscovered manuscripts that had been preserved in Eastern libraries and hidden archives. Humanist philosophers found in these ancient works confirmation of their belief that human beings possessed almost divine potential for knowledge and creativity. They saw themselves as recovering the pristine wisdom that had been corrupted by centuries of ecclesiastical ignorance and superstition. Natural magicians like John Dee claimed to communicate directly with angelic beings who revealed scientific and mathematical insights that advanced human understanding of astronomy, navigation, and cryptography. They believed they were restoring the proper relationship between humanity and the celestial hierarchy, unaware that they might be repeating the same pattern that had led to the original catastrophe. Their seances and magical rituals bore uncomfortable similarities to the practices that had first opened the doors between heaven and earth in the world before the flood. The scientific revolution that followed represented both the culmination and the transformation of humanity's ancient quest for divine knowledge. Galileo's telescope revealed new worlds in the heavens. Newton's mathematics described the fundamental forces that governed celestial mechanics, and experimental philosophers began to unlock the secrets of matter and energy that had been hidden since creation. Their methods were more rigorous, their conclusions more verifiable, Yet the underlying motivation remained unchanged: the desire to transcend mortal limitations through understanding. Francis Bacon's vision of science as the means to restore humanity's dominion over nature echoed the promises that had once seduced the Watchers themselves. He spoke of knowledge as power, of human ingenuity as the key to recovering the mastery over creation that had been lost in the fall. His followers sought to establish what they called Solomon's House, a repository of learning that would systematically investigate every aspect of the natural world until no mysteries remained hidden from human comprehension. The Enlightenment carried this project forward with unprecedented confidence, proclaiming the sovereignty of human reason over all traditional authorities, including divine revelation itself. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot saw themselves as liberating humanity from the darkness of superstition and ignorance. Yet their encyclopedic projects bore striking resemblances to the comprehensive knowledge systems that the Watchers had once shared with their mortal pupils. They promised that rational inquiry would eventually solve every human problem, overcome every natural limitation, and create a utopian society based on scientific principles rather than religious faith. The Industrial Revolution demonstrated the practical power of this accumulated knowledge as steam engines and mechanical looms transformed human civilization more rapidly than any previous development in history. The same metallurgical skills that Azazel had first revealed found their ultimate expression in factories that could produce goods on an unprecedented scale, while the astronomical observations that Barakijal had taught enabled navigation and timekeeping with supernatural precision. Yet the fruits of this industrial paradise came with costs that echoed the warnings preserved in ancient texts. The same technologies that promised liberation from natural constraints also created new forms of human bondage, as workers became slaves to mechanical rhythms and industrial schedules. The pollution that poured from factory smokestacks poisoned the air and water, while the social disruptions caused by rapid change shattered traditional communities and created urban environments that bred crime and despair. The atomic age brought these questions into unprecedented focus as scientists learned to split the atom and harness nuclear energy. The weapons they created could destroy entire cities in moments, while the peaceful applications of their discoveries promised to transform human civilization in fundamental ways. Like the Watchers sharing their celestial knowledge with humanity, they had opened doors that could never be closed, released forces that would reshape the world regardless of the intentions of their discoverers. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the first atomic explosion illuminate the New Mexico desert, reportedly quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." His words captured the terrible ambiguity of scientific achievement that promised both transcendence and annihilation, both godlike power and apocalyptic destruction. The same knowledge that could power cities and heal diseases could also end human civilization in a matter of hours. The parallels with Enochic warnings were not lost on thoughtful observers who saw in the nuclear age an echo of the antediluvian world described in ancient visions. Once again, humanity possessed knowledge that seemed almost divine in its scope and power. Once again, the temptation existed to use that knowledge for domination rather than service, for destruction rather than healing. Once again, the question arose whether mortals were ready for the responsibilities that came with such tremendous capabilities. In their laboratories and research facilities, modern scientists continued the work that had begun so long ago on the slopes of Mount Hermon. They unlocked the secrets of genetics that allowed them to manipulate the fundamental codes of life itself. They developed artificial intelligence systems that promised to exceed human cognitive abilities in every measurable category. They explored the quantum realm, where the boundary between mind and matter seemed to dissolve into probability waves and observer effects. Each breakthrough brought with it both tremendous potential for good and terrible possibilities for evil. Genetic engineering could eliminate hereditary diseases or create biological weapons more deadly than any plague. Artificial intelligence could solve humanity's greatest challenges or replace human workers entirely. quantum mechanics could provide unlimited clean energy or enable surveillance systems that made privacy impossible. The fundamental dynamic remained unchanged from the earliest days of human history. Each discovery that promised to elevate humanity also carried the risk of corruption and destruction. The knowledge itself was neutral, but the hearts that received it were still tainted by the same pride and selfish ambition that had motivated the original rebellion in heaven. Contemporary philosophers and ethicists struggled to develop frameworks for managing these new capabilities responsibly, yet their efforts often seemed inadequate to the magnitude of the challenges they faced. How could finite human wisdom properly govern technologies that approached infinite power? How could democratic institutions adapt quickly enough to regulate developments that advanced at exponential rates? How could moral principles established in simpler times provide guidance for dilemmas that previous generations could never have imagined? The questions that had first been raised in the antediluvian world continued to echo through every laboratory, every boardroom, every government office where decisions were made that would affect the future of human civilization. What knowledge should remain forbidden? What boundaries should not be crossed? What price was humanity willing to pay for the power to reshape creation according to its own desires? Religious thinkers from various traditions found themselves returning to ancient texts like the Book of Enoch for insights into these contemporary challenges. The story of the Watchers provided a framework for understanding the spiritual dimensions of technological development, the ways in which the pursuit of knowledge could become corrupted by pride and ambition. It reminded modern readers that the greatest dangers facing humanity often came not from ignorance, but from wisdom wielded without humility. Environmental scientists pointed to climate change and ecological destruction as evidence that humanity's dominion over nature had become as corrupted as the rule of the Nephilim in the world before the flood. The same industrial technologies that had promised to create paradise on Earth had instead produced a world where the very foundations of life were threatened by human activity. The giants of the ancient world had devoured all the acquisitions of men until they turned to consuming humanity itself. The corporate giants of the modern world seemed to be following a similar pattern as they consumed the natural resources of the earth without regard for future generations. Social critics observed that the information technologies that promised to connect humanity in unprecedented ways had also created new forms of isolation and manipulation. The same algorithms that could deliver personalized education and healthcare could also be used to spread misinformation and control behavior on a massive scale. The knowledge that was supposed to liberate humanity from ignorance and prejudice had instead become a tool for those who sought to consolidate power and eliminate opposition. Psychologists and sociologists noted the ways in which modern life seemed to replicate the psychological patterns that had led to the original rebellion in heaven. The constant pressure to achieve, to excel, to transcend limitations created a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction where enough was never enough. People sought meaning and purpose through accumulating knowledge, wealth, and power rather than through humble service and genuine relationships. The same restless ambition that had driven the Watchers to abandon their celestial posts now drove millions of individuals to sacrifice their physical health, mental well-being, and spiritual development in pursuit of worldly success. Yet amid all these contemporary parallels and warnings, there remained the possibility of redemption that had been purchased at such great cost in the centuries following the flood. The same technological capabilities that could be used for destruction could also serve healing and restoration. The same global communications networks that spread lies and hatred could also carry truth and love to every corner of the earth. The same scientific knowledge that threatened to destroy the natural world could also provide the insights needed to repair the damage and create sustainable ways of living. The choice remained what it had always been, between wisdom and folly, between service and self-aggrandizement, between the narrow path of righteousness and the broad highway that led to destruction. The Watchers had chosen rebellion and found themselves bound in chains of their own making. Humanity, inheriting both their gifts and their curse, faced the same choice in every generation, in every heart, in every moment when the voice of pride whispered that there were no limits that could not be transcended, no boundaries that should not be crossed. The flood that had cleansed their corrupted world remained both historical event and eternal warning, a reminder that even the patience of the divine had limits, that there were lines that could not be crossed without consequences that extended far beyond the individual transgressor. The waters had receded, but the questions they answered continued to flow through human consciousness like underground rivers, surfacing whenever humanity approached the same crossroads where the Watchers had made their fateful choice. And so their watch continued, not from the heights of heaven, but from the depths of their earthly prison, bound until the final judgment, yet somehow still present in every human choice between aspiration and humility, between reaching for the stars and remembering the ground beneath one's feet. Their rebellion had ended in chains, but their influence lived on in the eternal human struggle to find the balance between transcendence and submission, between the desire to become gods and the wisdom to remain faithful servants of the one true God who alone possessed the power to transform knowledge into wisdom, ambition into love, and mortal hearts into vessels worthy of divine grace. The memory of their transgression lived on in ways both subtle and profound, woven into the very fabric of human consciousness like threads of gold in a tapestry of darkness. In the monasteries of Ireland, where Celtic monks labored by candlelight to preserve the wisdom of ages, scribes would pause in their copying of sacred texts, their quills trembling as they encountered passages that spoke of angels who had loved too much and lost everything. They understood, perhaps better than their contemporaries, that knowledge without reverence was a poison that could corrupt even the purest hearts. The Viking skalds, those wandering poets of the northern lands, sang of gods who walked among mortals and bore children of immense power, their sagas echoing with memories of the Nephilim, though they knew not the source of their inspiration. In their mead halls, warriors would listen to tales of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, and feel in their bones the truth that all attempts to transcend the natural order ultimately led to destruction. Their mythology preserved the essential pattern: divine beings who overreached, hybrid offspring who brought chaos, and a cleansing that would wash the world clean for those worthy to inherit it. The Islamic scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba, inheritors of Greek philosophy and Persian wisdom, grappled with similar questions as they sought to reconcile reason with revelation. In their commentaries on the Quran, they found references to beings called the jinn, who possessed knowledge beyond mortal understanding, yet remained subject to the same temptations that had destroyed their angelic predecessors. Their alchemical treatises spoke of transformations that promised to elevate base matter into spiritual gold. Yet they understood that such work required not just technical skill, but moral purification, lest the seeker become corrupted by the very knowledge they pursued. The Jewish mystical tradition, preserved in the hidden chambers of the Kabbalah, maintained detailed records of angelic hierarchies and cosmic structures that bore striking resemblances to the revelations recorded in Enoch's visions. Their texts spoke of divine sparks scattered throughout creation by a primordial catastrophe, fragments of celestial light that could be gathered and restored through proper spiritual practice. Yet they also warned of the Qliphoth, the broken shells of corrupted knowledge that could trap the unwary seeker in labyrinths of pride and delusion. In the universities of medieval Europe, where scholastic philosophers attempted to create comprehensive systems of knowledge that would encompass all truth, the shadow of the Watcher's legacy could be discerned in every debate about the relationship between faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas, that great synthesizer of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, wrestled with questions that would have been familiar to Semjaza and his companions. How much could finite minds comprehend of infinite truth? What boundaries should limit human inquiry? How could one pursue understanding without falling into the trap of intellectual pride? The Cathars and other mystical movements that arose during this period carried within their teachings echoes of Enochic wisdom, speaking of a cosmic dualism between light and darkness that played out on every level of creation. They saw in the material world evidence of a great fall, a corruption of divine intention that could only be healed through rigorous spiritual discipline and the rejection of worldly attachments. Their persecution by ecclesiastical authorities perhaps reflected not just doctrinal disagreement, but a deeper fear of the kind of esoteric knowledge that had once led angels themselves astray. The Renaissance magus, standing in his carefully prepared chamber surrounded by grimoires and astrolabes, believed himself to be recovering the pristine wisdom that had been lost in the great catastrophe. John Dee, mathematical genius and angelic conjurer, claimed to receive revelations from celestial beings who spoke in a perfect language called Enochian, supposedly the tongue spoken before Babel's confusion. His conversations with entities who called themselves angels bore uncomfortable resemblances to the interactions that had first opened the floodgates of forbidden knowledge in the world before the flood. Pico della Mirandola, in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, proclaimed that human beings alone among created things possessed the freedom to ascend to angelic heights or descend to bestial depths through the exercise of their will and intellect. His words echoed with the same confidence that had once motivated celestial beings to abandon their proper stations in pursuit of experiences beyond their nature. The humanist dream of human perfectibility through knowledge and effort carried within it the same seeds of corruption that had destroyed the antediluvian world. The Protestant Reformation brought with it a renewed emphasis on Scripture alone as the source of religious authority. Yet this principle created new questions about texts like Enoch that had been quoted by biblical authors but excluded from the canon. Some reformers argued that books referenced by apostles should be considered divinely inspired, regardless of later ecclesiastical decisions. Others maintained that the early church's wisdom in establishing canonical boundaries should be respected, even if individual books contained valuable insights. Martin Luther, that great challenger of ecclesiastical authority, found himself paradoxically defending the Church's canonical decisions when faced with enthusiasts who claimed direct revelations from angelic beings. He had witnessed the confusion and division that arose when individuals claimed access to divine knowledge beyond what was contained in recognized Scripture. The same protest against human authority that had motivated his break with Rome also made him suspicious of those who sought to transcend the boundaries that protected ordinary believers from spiritual dangers. John Calvin, with his systematic theology and emphasis on divine sovereignty, understood perhaps better than his contemporaries the dangers inherent in any attempt to achieve salvation or enlightenment through human effort rather than divine grace. His doctrine of predestination served as a bulwark against the kind of spiritual pride that assumed human beings could earn their way to celestial status through superior knowledge or moral achievement. Yet even his followers sometimes fell into the trap of believing that their doctrinal correctness made them spiritually superior to those who held different theological opinions. The scientific revolution that emerged from Renaissance humanism represented both the culmination and transformation of humanity's ancient quest for divine knowledge. Galileo's telescope, revealing moons around Jupiter and phases of Venus, challenged not just astronomical theory, but the entire medieval worldview that placed Earth at the center of divine concern. His discoveries suggested that the universe was far vaster and more complex than previous generations had imagined, filled with worlds upon worlds that dwarfed human significance. Newton's Principia Mathematica demonstrated that the same mathematical laws governed both celestial and terrestrial mechanics, suggesting that the ancient distinction between the corruptible earth and the perfect heavens was an illusion born of ignorance. His equations described a clockwork universe that operated according to rational principles discoverable by human reason, yet his private studies of alchemy and biblical prophecy revealed a mind still captivated by the dream of hidden knowledge that could unlock the deepest secrets of creation. The Enlightenment philosophers, who built upon these scientific foundations, proclaimed the dawn of a new age in which human reason would finally triumph over superstition and ignorance. Voltaire's mockery of religious authority, Diderot's encyclopedic project to catalog all human knowledge, and Condorcet's vision of infinite human progress all reflected a confidence that would have been familiar to the Watchers who first shared celestial wisdom with mortal minds. Yet the fruits of this rational paradise came with costs that echoed the warnings preserved in ancient texts. The same technologies that promised liberation from natural constraints also created new forms of human bondage. The Industrial Revolution that followed demonstrated the practical power of accumulated scientific knowledge while simultaneously revealing its potential for exploitation and destruction. Factory workers became slaves to mechanical rhythms. Urban environments bred poverty and disease, and the pollution that poured from industrial smokestacks began the slow poisoning of air and water that continues to this day. The democratic revolutions that swept across Europe and America during this period promised to extend the benefits of enlightenment to all people, yet they also unleashed forces of nationalism and ideological conflict that would prove even more destructive than the religious wars they were meant to replace. The same rational principles that justified individual liberty and human rights could also be used to construct totalitarian systems that claimed scientific authority for their programs of social engineering and racial purification. The atomic age brought these contradictions into stark relief as scientists learned to harness the fundamental forces that held matter together. The weapons they created possessed destructive power that exceeded anything imagined by previous generations, while the peaceful applications of nuclear energy promised to solve humanity's energy needs forever. Like the Watchers who had shared celestial fire with mortal recipients unprepared for its power, atomic scientists found themselves grappling with responsibilities that seemed almost godlike in their scope and consequences. The space age that followed represented humanity's most literal attempt to transcend terrestrial limitations and reach toward the heavens. Rockets carrying human beings beyond the atmosphere fulfilled dreams that had motivated mythmakers and visionaries for millennia. Yet the same technologies that enabled lunar exploration also made possible intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads to any point on Earth within minutes. The conquest of space became another arena for earthly conflicts rather than the transcendent experience that had inspired its pioneers. The information age brought the promise of universal access to human knowledge through global communications networks. The internet seemed to fulfill ancient dreams of a universal library that would make all learning available to anyone with the curiosity to seek it. Yet the same technologies that democratized information also enabled unprecedented surveillance and manipulation. Social media platforms designed to connect people across vast distances often served instead to isolate them in echo chambers of confirmation bias and tribal hostility. Genetic engineering opened the possibility of eliminating hereditary diseases and enhancing human capabilities in ways that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations. Scientists learned to read and rewrite the fundamental codes that governed all life, promising to cure conditions that had plagued humanity since the fall. Yet the same techniques that could heal could also be used to create biological weapons more deadly than any natural plague, or to engineer genetic modifications that would create new forms of inequality between the enhanced and the unmodified. Artificial intelligence development progressed toward creating machines that could exceed human cognitive abilities in every measurable category. The prospect of superintelligent systems promised to solve humanity's greatest challenges while simultaneously raising existential questions about the future of human relevance. If machines could think faster, more accurately, and more comprehensively than their creators, what role would remain for biological intelligence in a world of artificial minds? Each of these developments carried within it the same fundamental tension that had driven the Watchers to their doom, the desire to transcend limitations through knowledge and power rather than through submission to divine will. The technologies themselves were morally neutral, Yet their development and application invariably reflected the same pride and ambition that had corrupted celestial beings in the world before the flood. And so the story echoes through eternity, a warning written not in stone, but in the very fabric of human ambition itself. From the laboratories of genetic engineers to the server farms of artificial intelligence, from the boardrooms of global corporations to the secret chambers where power brokers reshape the world according to their desires, the whisper of the Watchers persists. Why remain bound by limitations when transcendence beckons just beyond reach? Their rebellion may have ended in chains, their giants may have perished beneath the flood, but their legacy lives on in every heart that mistakes knowledge for wisdom, power for righteousness, and the creature for the Creator. The Book of Enoch stands as testament to truths too dangerous for comfort, yet too essential to forget, reminding us that some boundaries exist not to confine us, but to protect us from the darkness that lies beyond them.